My name's Anthony Mikulec. I'm a professor of otolaryngology at St. Louis University and a proud member of the Bander Center for Medical Business Ethics at SLU. The Bander Center for Medical Business Ethics is an ethics center housed in the School of Medicine at St. Louis University that focuses on education and research about issues in medical business ethics. It was established in 2007 based on a charitable grant from Dr. Steve Bander and the BF Charitable Foundation. We have an educational mission, a scholarly arm, and we put on events like this one. My highest hope is that someone here today will get a spark from something that was said or meet someone compelling to collaborate with, start a project, network, invest in something worthwhile, start a company, change the world for the better. I would first like to welcome all of the attendees who are here today, who are part of the Cortex community, and I'm thrilled that my guest today is Dr. Stephen Miller. Dr. Miller is a nationally recognized advocate for fair drug pricing, supports government relations, and leads the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, manages the medical affairs team, and interfaces with client groups. His expertise represents years as a medical researcher, clinician, and administrator, and spans numerous healthcare subjects. Steve has served as Chief Medical Officer of Express Scripts since 2006, and focuses on clinical matters, including e-prescribing initiatives, specialty solutions, and overall development of products that make prescription drugs safer and more affordable. He previously was the Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Barnes Jewish Hospital, Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. He received his medical degree from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He trained in the Pathology and Research Fellowship at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He was the William J. and Dorothy Fish Kerr Fellow in Cardiology at the University of California, San Francisco. Steve also did internal medicine training at the University of Colorado and nephrology and transplantation at WashU. He earned his MBA at the Olin School of Business at WashU. Welcome, Dr. Miller. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go ahead and dive in. How and why did you get involved in the business side of medicine?
Yeah, so I've been the luckiest person in the world. I have an incredible family, but I've also had a very fortunate career. So I started out as a really good person, as a clinician taking care of patients. At WashU, I became involved in the administration, so we developed a renal business. I then went on the practice plan of Washington University. At that point in time, went back and got my MBA, and then got a cold call out of the blue from Express Scripts to say, would you come look at a position there? Was fortunate, went there. It was if you ever read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, she says when you're invited onto a rocket ship, don't ask which seat, just get on. Express Scripts was that rocket ship at the time. At the time, we were taking care of 10 million people. Now we take care of over 80 million people. And then most recently, which isn't included in it, I've just recently then have moved to become the Chief Medical Officer for Cigna and Express Scripts since the purchase of Express Scripts by Cigna. So I've had the great fortune and just a really wonderful career.
Wonderful. So what does Express Scripts do? It's got a big beehive by the airport. What goes on in there?
Yeah. So, Express Scripts is several businesses, but the biggest part of the business is what's called pharmacy benefits management, which no one understands what that is, but it's actually relatively simple. Express Scripts aggregates lives, so they go out to different companies, be it WashU, St. Louis University, Emerson, Boeing, whatever, and they get those lives, and they've aggregated 80 million lives. And with those lives, they go to the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and they say, 10 of you make penicillin. Which one wants to get our market share? If you want our market share, what kind of discounts are you going to give us? Because we're going to pass those discounts on to patients and to their employers. They do the exact same thing with retail pharmacies. There's 70,000 retail pharmacies, often 3 on a corner. They'll go to the retail pharmacies and say, we have 80 million people. We can direct them into your store or someone else's store. Which of you are going to give us the biggest discounts? And with those discounts, again, we pass them on to the patient and the employer. And so it's really, and then the other businesses we have, so that's the pharmacy benefits management. We're also, because a big mail order pharmacy If you looked at us and the number of scripts we dispense, we would be the 4th largest pharmacy in the United States. And then we're a specialty pharmacy where these rare and orphan disease drugs come from. We're the 2nd largest specialty pharmacy. So we have lots of businesses under the umbrella of Express Scripts.
Yeah. So it seems like Express Scripts has grown by leaps and bounds. And why has it been so successful?
Yeah, because it turns out that companies cannot drive their pharmacy expenses down without a company like Express Scripts. So if you think about it, while you hear in the marketplace a lot of people saying, oh, these PBMs are horrible, they're adding to the cost of pharmaceuticals, no one's figured out how to control the cost of pharmaceuticals without them. In fact, I'll give you a funny anecdote. It turns out 100% of pharmaceutical manufacturers use a pharmacy benefits manager to get the prices down for their own employees. And so we're a necessary part of the supply chain trying to drive those costs down. And so, like I said, we've gone from 10 million people when I joined the company to now representing over 80 million lives. And so we've been just getting bigger and better at what we do over time.
How many PBMs are out there? Who's your biggest competitor?
Yeah, so there's what we call the big 3. So Express Scripts, CVS, which is now CVS Aetna, United, Optum, so those are the big 3, and then there's about 40 others that compete in the marketplace.
Okay, so it seems like size is a virtue in this business.
So if you're going to try to negotiate with the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the more lives that you can shift, the more successful you're going to be. So the big 3 have about 70% of the marketplace, and then the other 40 are the other 30% of the marketplace.
Well, since size is so important, how did Express Scripts make it from being small? It must have done something to be more successful than its competitors to get that large market share.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into that?
Well, since I was there, I assume it was
because
of
me,
you,
of course.
right?
Yeah.
And I keep reminding my bosses that's the case. But it turns out there are several ways we grew. One was what's called organically. That is, we would just one business in the marketplace. So as SLU would go out to bid, we would go bid on them, and we would win that way. The second way we grew is just through what's called mergers and acquisitions. When a PBM would be up for sale, we would buy them, put everyone on our systems, gain more scale, get what are called more synergies, and drive more waste out of the system. And so through those 2 mechanisms, we've gotten to be really large.
How many people work at Express Scripts?
So Express Scripts has 28,000 employees. Cigna had about 50,000 employees, so the combined company is now 78,000 people.
What do all those people do?
Yeah. So as you know, in healthcare administration, one of the things that drives all of us nuts is you have the biggest group of patients, of employees, work in call centers answering people's questions because we've obviously made healthcare way too complex. The second biggest group is actually in IT, so creating digital solutions so that people could actually not have to interface with the people, but could actually do self-service. And so IT groups are the second largest. And then you have an enormous number of clinicians. So for Express Scripts, our clinicians are mainly pharmacists. We have almost 2,000 pharmacists out of that 28,000 people, and they're working with patients every day. So it's a great job for a pharmacist because unlike the traditional retail pharmacist where you're having to work with the insurance companies or count out pills, these people are truly counseling patients on side effects, how to get to better outcomes, how to get to a lower cost product, and so they find it incredibly fulfilling.
So how does a patient end up talking to an Express Script pharmacist? What's the algorithm there?
Yeah, so there's 2 ways. One is if you're having a question, you call in, but also we actually proactively call out to people. So we actually have been able, we're a big data company. We have pharmacy data on 80 million people. We have the medical claims data on 25 million people. We have laboratory data on 15 million people. We actually can predict which patients are less likely to take their medications than others. And so if we see you haven't filled a prescription, we actually know who to call out to, how to get them hopefully back on their medications, taking their medicines. And so And then there are certain groups of patients where you can, or the high-risk patients that need a lot of attention, they actually have a continuous relationship with a pharmacist, nurse, or social worker.
Now, you mentioned that you have access to lab results. Tell me about that. I find that interesting. Where does that come from?
Yeah, so so obviously you know where we get the pharmacy data from. About 40% of our business is other health plans. So we're servicing Blue Cross, Blue Shield of this, or Mutual of that. And those health plans will not only share their medical data with us, but they'll often share their laboratory data they get. And then we also have connections with many of the EMRs, so we're able to get an enormous amount of data on every patient. And obviously, this is all HIPAA compliant, the patient controls their data, but it gives you the opportunity to do incredible research. And so we actually have affiliations with not only SLU and Washington University, but many of the major universities. We're currently participating in over a dozen grants, and we do that at no cost to the investigator. So when an investigator wants to work with us, we give our services as a value added, but we also have to control the data, obviously.
Okay. It's interesting synergy. It seems like the patient wants lower cost medications, and obviously you want the same thing as well. Of the people that work at Express Scripts, how many lobbyists do you guys have?
So our Washington office, which reports to me, has a total of 6 people. And so those, and not all of those are lobbyists. And so we have, I believe, probably 4 registered lobbyists.
And what are the issues that you feel that Express Scripts needs to lobby on?
Well, so the biggest thing at the federal level is obviously healthcare, and specifically pharmacy, is actually the most talked about issue right now. If you think about it, in the last couple of weeks, you've heard the president float all sorts of ideas. So remember, the president had a Rose Garden address in the spring. He put out his blueprint for pharmaceuticals, asked for suggestions, and now Congress and the regulators are trying to digest all that stuff and put new regulations and legislation out there. And you can see across the parties incredibly different ideas. The good news is this: for the first time in my career, both Republicans and Democrats are talking about the same issue and often using the same words. And so this is actually a great opportunity to see if we can fix this for the betterment of patients and for society, because the current course we're on is obviously not sustainable.
Yeah, something can't go on forever, it won't, right?
Right.
So run us through an average week for you at Express Scripts. What do you do?
Yeah, so the great thing about my job is it's different every day. I'll give you an example. This week I did a day of filming with the New York Times because they're doing an article about high-cost drugs. But we'll meet with regulators, legislators, companies, patient groups, all sorts of groups throughout the week, trying to figure out what are better solutions, but also getting to build coalitions. I'm also the chairman of the board of an organization or a company called SureScripts. They're the ones that route all the electronic prescriptions throughout the country. So trying to actually put tools in the hands of doctors to make it simpler, cut out friction and fragmentation so that patients can actually have a better experience in what currently is a really complex system. So my job, my daily activities are different almost every single day, which is what makes my job so wonderful.
Yeah, sounds interesting. So Express Scripts is a publicly traded company, and like all publicly traded companies, your primary obligation is to make money for your shareholders. So how does Express Scripts make money for its shareholders?
Yeah, so the great thing about this model, and one of the reasons why I felt comfortable going to Express Scripts, is we have what's called a model of alignment. When we save patients money and when we save employers money, we make money. So the best thing we do is actually move patients to a generic drug. So if you think about it, a generic, by FDA definition, is identical to its branded counterpart, but the price is often dramatically lower. And so the patient gets the same great health outcomes, usually at a much lower copay, and the patient, as you know, in pharmacy pays about 15% of the price your employer pays 85% of the price. Patient saves money, the employer saves money, and in our model, they allow us to keep some of that difference, and so we make money. And so that's been a model for success for the history of this company, and it really works well because that model of alignment, where the patient has to do better, the employer has to do better for us to do better, really works.
Okay. So Cigna and Express Scripts recently merged. You mentioned that. Why did they merge?
Yeah, so as you touched on a bit earlier, these are scale businesses, and what you're seeing in the marketplace is everyone's trying to get to even greater scale. So you've seen Aetna merge with CVS in the last couple of months. You've seen Express Scripts merge with Cigna. The other thing that's really important to me, which is why I'm really excited about this, is historically we have bought these benefits in silos, right? Your medical benefit, your pharmacy benefit. Patients don't live in those silos. Patients really care about the total experience. And so if you can actually give them a better experience and really focus not on the individual costs on the medical side or the pharmacy side, but total cost of care, you're going to get to a much better solution. And so I'm hoping that the future is actually more focused on total cost of care and total experience for the patient, taking down these barriers so we don't have so much friction and fragmentation.
Now, you might be familiar with Kaiser Health Systems out in California, where incentives are aligned because the physicians, the insurance scheme, and the patients are all basically one entity. What do they do for their pharmacy benefits? Do they have their own PBM? Or?
Yeah. So Kaiser actually has their own PBM. And what's interesting about Kaiser is the Kaiser model has been phenomenal, especially on the West Coast. As you know, as Kaiser has tried to transport that model to other parts of the country, especially where they don't have total ownership of everything. So remember, in California, Kaiser owns the doctors, the hospitals, the laboratory, the pharmacy, everything. In other marketplaces, they try to collaborate, where they'll use another hospital or they'll use a physician group. And as you know, their results have been very difficult to replicate as you move across the country. So it's a really effective model where you have total control. It doesn't work, it unfortunately doesn't work much better than the other fragmented models when you move it outside of California.
Because again, they don't have the scale probably necessary.
Well, it's not just the scale, but you're asking doctors to do, and other providers to do something that's really unnatural. Even in your own practice, you're going to see some patients that are fee-for-service, you're going to see other patients that are under capitation. It is really difficult to flip back and forth and treat them different. In fact, you find it as a practitioner almost immoral to treat them any different. And so there's a mindset that comes when you treat fee-for-service, and there's a mindset that comes when you're fully capitated. And the beauty of the Kaiser model is in California, every patient is under the same model, and so that drives greater efficiency.
Yeah. So when Cigna and Express Scripts merged, did that require antitrust approval?
Yeah, so so all these big deals have to be approved. Our deal had to go through what's called the Justice Department, and so that was the major hurdle. And then, but also it has to clear all 50 states' insurance commissions.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of regulatory scrutiny that occurs for all these.
Okay. And why is scrutiny necessary in this kind of merger?
Well, I think that the trouble is the question the regulators have to ask is, are the consumers going to be better off after this merger? Will this merger result in a better cost profile for patients? If you cannot prove that, then obviously they would be reluctant to approve it. And so you have to be able to demonstrate that the mergers result in improvements for patients. It is not, the question is not, will it hurt your competitor or not? Because that's not what they're concerned with. It's really about, do patients, do consumers have a better, are they better off because of the merger?
Do you think they will be better off, and if so, why?
Yeah, so I think that because of this model of alignment where the money goes back to the patient, the plan sponsor, and then we also keep some money, I think that the scale will make a difference. And so, and we're already seeing this. And so we've actually told the marketplace that there's about $600 million of annual synergies here. And so we're starting to see that happen. And so hopefully our plans will see their bills and their patients will see their bills go down in aggregate by that much.
So you've mentioned several times that scale is important in this business, but when is too much scale too much? What is an oligopoly or monopoly? How many PBMs and insurers need to be out there to make it a functional and competitive system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission both have ideas of what that is. And so I believe, and they haven't formally said this because they always reserve judgment till the next deal, but I suspect it's going to be very hard to see the big three go down to, for instance, the big two. I think you're pretty much done seeing big deals on the PBM side.
Okay. So the other rising star in the metro area here has been Centene. Do you work with Centene at all, or is there any interplay between Express Scripts and Centene?
Yeah, so Centene is a managed Medicaid company, so they take care of patients, essentially the poorest of the poor. So these are and they sell their services to the different states to manage their Medicaid. They actually have their own pharmacy benefits manager within them, and so we actually have no connection to Centene.
Okay, so not really competitors and not...
Compete slightly in that in some states we do Medicaid, we've been asked to come in and do Medicaid, but for the most part, we're not very competitive with them. We're not doing the same business.
So you don't, for example, do pharmacy benefits for Home State Health or other Centene managed Medicaid products?
So we, like I mentioned previously, about 40% of our clients our business is other health plans. Some of those health plans are in the Medicaid business in their state, so we'll support them in their state. So it's indirectly that we may be supporting someone in Medicaid.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about the delivery of pharmaceuticals, but I think the question we all have as consumers is why are drugs so darn expensive in this country? And I'd like to kind of separate that question out into two questions. One, is there simple drugs, generic drugs, which you mentioned, Lipitor, propranolol, potassium chloride, things that have been around forever, really should not cost very much to make, but still the price seems to go up every year. So that's, I would say, one basket. And then the other basket that maybe we can talk about second is the new drugs, the really, really expensive drugs that maybe have fantastic results, but how can we afford to use them for everyone? And in the end, you probably have to ration care, but how do we do that equitably? So maybe we can take the easy part first and talk about the generics.
Yeah, so the generics, generics have been one of the great things in healthcare. And as you know, the FDA regulates generics, and generic drugs, despite the misperception, are actually getting cheaper. If you look at generics over the last 10 years, inflation has been really flat. It's been, over 10 years, it's 15% in aggregate over 10 years. The price of generic drugs have gone down by 60% over that same period of time. Now, what you're talking about is your experience, and that is you're still hearing these things about these drugs, amoxicillin or other things that are sky high. But if you take truly the thousands of generic drugs that are out there, they've gone down by 60%. And that's actually been one of the good things that's held healthcare expenses down. But there are but the generics, especially the generics doctors use in hospitals, are having difficulties in staying in supply, and they're going up. There's a couple arguments of why this is. One is because the price has gone down so low, the generic companies are actually going out of business, and so the marginal capacity, that is the ability to ramp up when you need it, just isn't there. If a company runs into trouble because the FDA comes in and says, you know, there's a problem with manufacturing here, and that company closes down, all of a sudden you have this tremendous shortage of generics in the marketplace. Now, in the past, the generic availability was self-regulating. What I mean by that is if one company got into trouble, 5 other companies had a license to make that generic product. They would jump in because they would see a shortage in the marketplace. They'd see an opportunity to make money in the short run, and they'd start producing, and the price would come down. So it'd be self-regulating. You all may have heard that the FDA got behind in generic approvals. In fact, they were 4 years behind. So now what happens is you have a shortage of a generic product. If I want to jump in and reactivate my license, I got to decide as a business decision, is it still going to be in short supply 4 years from now when I get my application approved? Should I jump back in? The market quit being self-regulating or self-correcting. We have a new FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, who is spectacular. Dr. Gottlieb has put a high priority on fixing the generic problem. The generic backlog is down to 2 years, but he did something else really important. It used to be that the FDA had to consider applications in the order in which they came in. Dr. Gottlieb said, no. The FDA will now consider applications based on shortage in the marketplace. And so if a drug gets in short supply and we have an application in the pile for that drug, we'll move them to the top. And so you're hearing about fewer shortages over the last couple of years. The backlog has dropped, and generic pricing is actually continuing to go down. So overall, generics are actually a savior for pharmaceutical pricing because they continue to be cheap and should be going forward.
Yeah, there have been some really astounding shortages. As a surgeon, lidocaine with epinephrine, which is used in basically every surgical case to anesthetize and decrease bleeding in the wound, all of a sudden was in short supply. And I was told it was because of the hurricane in Puerto Rico, and that a lot of the manufacturing for tax reasons occurs in Puerto Rico.
Correct.
Is that true? Was I being told something that's true or not?
No. And so what I mentioned is most of the short supplies are for hospital-based products. It turns out that almost all the drugs that we use in the United States are not produced in the 48 states. They're in Puerto Rico for 2 reasons, tax reasons and environmental law reasons, because it's not a clean industry. And this is the exact case I was trying to make. If one thing happens to one provider, all of a sudden the system is so fragile that you don't have others that can move in right away. You've probably heard about a consortium of hospitals that are starting their own generics company. It's for this very purpose. It's to make sure that hospital-needed products don't fall into short supply. And so hopefully they're going to be successful in producing products so that you're not experiencing these things. But this is how fragile the marketplace has become.
Now, something you just said sort of jumped out at me. You said that it's not a clean industry. And are we polluting Puerto Rico by making all our drugs there? Or what's going on?
I'm not an expert in that. I just know that, when you think about environmental laws and where all these companies have shifted for production, there is very little drug production in the United States now.
So does Express Scripts import drugs from Europe or from Israel or from other places where they perhaps can be manufactured more cheaply? Is that legal in the U.S. and does Express Scripts do it?
Yeah, so we source drugs from all over the world. We actually send people on site to inspect facilities. There are certain manufacturers we will not buy from because they're not dependable enough. Certain countries we won't buy in. And so, yes, but we do source internationally.
Do you buy from China?
We, right now, are not buying products from China.
Okay. So what does Europe do with their generics? Where do they get their drugs? And do they have PBMs in Europe, or how does it work?
So in Europe, remember, these are mostly single-payer systems, and they can set prices. So they actually don't use generics near as much in Europe as we do here, because they can often get the brand at what are near generic prices. And so they, as single payers, they're able to set price. The other thing that Europe is doing that's really important to me is they have allowed what are called biosimilars in the marketplace. So generic drugs are for the tablets, capsules that you're used to. When you have a biologic drug, that is a drug that's been made in a cell and then made into a drug. So I'll give you an example. You take the growth hormone gene, you put that growth hormone gene in E. coli, you grow up a bunch of growth hormone, you purify it. That's a biologic. And those drugs are never the same, even batch to batch, what's more across manufacturers. So they're called biosimilars. Europe will allow biosimilars in their marketplace. You take the biggest selling drugs in America is Humira. Humira is a $14 billion product. It costs in the United States close to $3,000 a month. In Europe, it's 70% off, and the maker of that drug is a US company that can't sell their product in the United States. So it's a biosimilar to the originator. It works just as well, but people can actually afford it and take it. And it's available in Europe, and that's been a huge godsend for the European population. And it's one of the frustrations I have here is we don't have that available in America, even though it should be.
Yeah, interesting. You might have heard in the news that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates were going to get together and solve healthcare somehow. Have you heard anything more on that? Are they going to get in the pharmacy space into making these drugs that are generics and that have been around for 50 years and make them in bulk?
So probably know a little bit more than I should. That is, it's Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, and JP Morgan. They have started a collaborative. They hired Atul Gawande, who's a spectacular physician surgeon from Harvard, to run this collaborative. They're trying to figure out how to change healthcare. They want to use their population of 1.3 million employees across those three companies as kind of a test bed. We currently do a lot of work with them, so we are quite knowledgeable about what's going on. You got to remember, in your lives, you've heard a lot of companies are going to come and slay healthcare. Apple was going to change healthcare. Google Health was going to change healthcare. Microsoft Health Vaults was going to change healthcare. And as you know, many of these things have come and gone. Healthcare is different than all other consumer products. And so you don't pay for it yourself. You want your insurance to pay for it. Most products you can buy without a prescription. In healthcare, you actually have to have a prescription. And so it's highly regulated. And so those who enter it in with their own peril. Will someone actually crack the code? And are we excited to work with these different groups? Absolutely. The system is broken. We actually need to re-engineer the system. And so I invite all these people to the table because there is no shortage of good ideas. We need good ideas. And so if their companies can come with good ideas, we need to figure out how to test, learn, and evolve the system.
Yeah, agreed. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about those exciting new drugs made by little startup companies. Maybe there's one here in Cortex that treat diseases that had no treatment, but the flip side is that they're unbelievably expensive and perhaps a little difficult to predict when one of these is going to roll out. Can you comment on the struggles there and the issues?
Before we get to that, I actually want to talk about one other bucket of drugs, and that's branded products. So we talked about generics. Remember that generics, 90% of every dispense is for a generic drug. 10% of dispenses are for a branded drug. If you go back to that same thing I was talking about, the 10 years of flat inflation, if you look at the same drugs over those 10 years, they've gone up by 208%. You cannot name for me a single other product that you consume that's been allowed to take that kind of price increase over the last 10 years. This is really what's actually stressing out the system, because this is actually Gleevec going from $25,000 a year to $125,000 a year. Not new and improved Gleevec, not long-acting Gleevec. This is the exact same tablet. If you take drugs, I'll give you another one, erectile dysfunction. Viagra, when it came to the market, was $7 a tablet. It's now $49 a tablet. It has the exact same effect as it had when it came to the marketplace. This is unconscionable to me. No other product's been allowed to do this. And this is actually what's driving pharmaceutical costs up even more than the new products. So I apologize for that aside, but obviously it gets me very excited.
Well, let's stick with that then.
Okay.
What is the solution? I mean, I think we agree that that's a problem, and I agree that's a problem, but what do you do?
Yeah, so the number one thing you need is obviously competition. And so how do you create more competition when someone has a patent product? We had actually always argued that when Obamacare was being argued, they were actually arguing about how long should a drug have a patent. As you know, in the United States, we actually provide the longest patent life for products. And so we actually pay that really high price longer than anyone. The second thing we do is we have allowed, because of the patents, the court challenges keep biosimilar or generic competition from coming to the marketplace. Let me give you the example of Humira again. The typical drug, the typical oral solid tablet, has about 5 patents. The typical biologic will have 50 patents. Humira has filed over 250 patents. Why? Because that's their strategy to make sure competition never comes to the marketplace. And so when you think that a drug has been on the marketplace for, let's say, 20 years, you would think that if, even in the United States, if you're allowing 12 years of exclusivity, how can it be unchallenged 20 years later? Because if I keep filing patents year after year after year, I keep extending that exclusivity period. So this is a concept called evergreening. It is only allowed, it's rare, it's to the United States, and so we have got to do both regulatory and legislative changes if we're going to have normalization of this marketplace.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, how about those moonshot drugs?
Yeah. So this is actually really exciting. So one of the things you probably don't realize, so you hear the pharmaceutical companies always talking about, woe is me, there's no new products in the pipeline. The reason I have to have expensive prices is because I need to be able to develop things. It turns out that if you look at the pipeline in America, so this is unique just in America, and you talk about drugs that are just in human testing, so phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, there are 7,000 drugs in human testing today, more than at any time in my 40 years in healthcare. And if you say, well, woe is me, not only is there nothing in the pipeline, but we can't get anything through the FDA, that too is a bunch of malarkey. The FDA actually approved more drugs last year than in any year in its history, and it's been going up every single year. So we have tons of drugs in the pipeline, we have tons of drugs getting approved, so you say, why do I need those high prices, if the system is actually working so well? It turns out that pharmaceutical companies just do incredibly well. And I don't begrudge them. So I'm a basic scientist by training. I did primary drug discovery. I have a bunch of patents with the pharmaceutical companies. If my drug had ever worked out, I'd be on some island and not shilling for Express Scripts today. But the reality is that the new drugs coming out are mostly what we call specialty drugs. They're for the rare and orphan diseases. And the drug companies have the capability to price whatever they want. And so while they'll give you a song and dance of how scientific the pricing is, I will contend it's really what the market will bear. Let me give you some proof. In the last 2 years, there has not been a single oncology product brought to the marketplace for less than $100,000 a year. Now, does every single one of these products have the exact same developmental cost, the same production cost? Obviously not. But they know that that is actually the new benchmark by which you can price an oncology product. So it doesn't matter if it's an oral solid tyrosine kinase that's made for pennies a pill or some really advanced biologic, they're all over $100,000. Now, we're about to enter a really exciting era. Gene therapy is not just in the future, gene therapy is here today. And it turns out that our company is the only company that actually handles all the gene therapies. So we have developed tools and models to help patients and these companies bring these to the marketplace. The first true gene therapy that was brought to the United States is a drug called Luxturna. It's for a form of pediatric blindness. So your child is born with normal sight, and then when they get close to 10 years, their vision starts deteriorating. You take them usually to an optometrist, you get glasses, that really doesn't fix it. It turns out scientists have figured out the gene that's causing the retinal deterioration. You can take these kids to the OR. It's $425,000 per eye. The retina surgeon puts this in the back of the eye. It does not fix their vision, but it stops further deterioration. There's now been a handful of people treated with this. The results have been extraordinary. We just got a letter from a girl. She had failed her driver's test time after time again. She now has a driver's license. I mean, this is really cool stuff. In the first quarter of this year, there's probably going to be a drug for spinal muscular atrophy. It's a 100% lethal disorder. The kids usually die by age 2. This drug may actually restore them to a normal life. There are gene therapies that are coming for hemophilia, sickle cell, many other diseases. The trouble is, all of them are going to be priced probably close to or north of $1 million. And the question is, as a society, how do we handle these things? Because not only are they really expensive, but they're one-time treatments. So other drugs that are really expensive, you can pay for over time. This, you're going to have to come up with this lump sum payment of $1.5 million. There is no model for this in the marketplace. We've actually been leading in the innovation for this. So we have actually figured out how to do what's called amortized payments, where people can pay over time. We've been doing what are called value-based contracts. So you take this drug for blindness. They priced it as if it should work for a lifetime, but you don't know if it's going to. What if it quits working after the 5th year? And so what we've done is we've made contracts where the pharmaceutical manufacturer would actually have to refund money over time if the drug quit working. And so we're going to have to be just as innovative on the payment side as the manufacturers have been on the science side if we're going to be able to figure out how to do this.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff coming down the pipeline. Well, let's go back to something a little bit more mundane. As a clinician, and as a consumer, the price transparency really gets at me. So when I sit in the clinic and I'm trying to prescribe Ciprodex antibiotic steroid ear drops to someone in the clinic, nobody has any idea how much it's going to cost. I have no idea. The patient doesn't know. The resident doesn't know. When we look it up on Epic, the computer doesn't know. Nobody knows anything. And it's really frustrating for everyone because Ciprodex might cost $0 or it might cost someone $300. And so if it costs $300, then that patient's calling back to the clinic to try to get a different prescription, and then sometimes the pharmacist knows what'll be cheaper and sometimes they don't. And so it just turns into kind of a bureaucratic nightmare that's repeated over and over and over again. And so now that, why is that? Why does nobody know what anything costs? When I go to McDonald's, I order a Big Mac, it says how much it's going to cost.
Right. So remember, in healthcare, there actually is no price transparency for almost anything you buy in healthcare. So if you go to a hospital, you have no idea what the gallbladder surgery is going to cost you, and you initially get this thing that says this is not a bill, and it has some astronomical number, and then over time that number keeps coming down. And the same thing is true for physician services, right? There is what the university or your practice put out there as your billed charge, what you actually accept from the insurance company, totally different number. It is really important in pharmacy because remember, pharmacy is the #1 way people experience healthcare. You go to your doctor on average less than twice a year. You go to a hospital on average less than once a year. You use pharmacy about 12 times a year. And so if you're going to get frustrated because of the lack of this transparency thing, it's going to be about drugs because that's how the average person experiences healthcare. So I agree, and the nuttiness about this is those prices have gone up. We have gotten discounts back for our patients and our plan sponsors through the form of what's called a rebate. A rebate is just a discount, but it's paid in retrospect, not prospectively. So a discount is, Walmart's going to buy Coca-Cola. They say we're going to buy so much Coca-Cola, how big of a discount? What happens in drugs is we never know how many of a particular drug is going to be used over the course of the year. And so what happens is every quarter you tell the manufacturer we used 10 units of penicillin, we want our discount, and they pay it back. So it's a very convoluted system. There is a solution for this, and it's now being put into the marketplace. I told you I was the chairman of the board of a company called SureScripts. What we have done is we've come up with a system called real-time benefit check. Real-time benefit check allows, as a doctor is prescribing on his EMR, or his electronic medical record, the doctor will be able to see for that specific patient, what are the choices available for that patient under their health plan, and what is the patient's copay going to be for that drug, and what the total price of the drug is going to be. That system has now been rolled out, and you got to remember, we can do it for everyone today. The trouble is you need the EMR systems to actually come back, reprogram your EMR so it displays. We now have it available for 105,000 doctors or providers in the United States. Remember, there's about 1.2 million providers when you consider your nurses and the doctors and all. And so we believe there's a solution for it. And when we've tested it to say, how often does it actually change what you prescribe? It's 28% of the time, so it's huge. And so it doesn't mean that you always can find a cheaper version, but oftentimes you can. And remember, as a physician, I'm often indifferent. I don't care which statin I put you on, but I'd love to know the first time around what's the one that your plan covers, because every single plan seems to have some other preferred product. And so when do I think this will actually be at a doctor near you? I think this rollout's going to take about 5 years, to be very frank. That's a shorter time than the e-prescribing rollout took. That actually took over a decade for docs to be e-prescribing on a routine basis. But I think that over the next 5 years, what you're going to see is real-time benefit checking. I think it's going to be a great thing for consumers. Now remember, it doesn't change the price of the drug per se. It just tells you what your most cost-effective choice is going to be.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very important because, as you say, in many cases there are alternatives, and the physician doesn't much mind using something different or cheaper, and everyone would like to know, well, how about just rolling out an app for your iPhone for now that Cigna and Express Scripts are combined? So how about every covered Cigna Live has an app that says this is the price for propranolol, here's diltiazem.
Already done. So
already done? That's
already done. The trouble is this. So we have an Express Scripts app. You can download it if you're a member. You can actually pull up any product, look at the price. It will not only tell you the price, it will tell you the alternatives. It will also tell you the difference where you get it filled. Is Walgreens the same price as CVS, Walmart, or others? So that's already built. The trouble is this. It's at the patient level, not the physician level. So the patient actually would have to pull it up in your office. As you know, in the little bit of time you have, that's probably not going to work into your workflow particularly well. And so, so that type of data is out there, and it turns out the vast majority of patients, don't download it, they don't look at it, they just trust you to prescribe something. And since you're not going to want to wait to see the patient pull this up, and remember, the other thing is you're seeing patients from all sorts of plans. So while Express Scripts has 80 million lives, remember I told you 40 million of my lives are through another health plan. So it's not the Express Scripts app that they need, it's the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Missouri app. If when I practiced at WashU had over 300 different provider contracts, different insurers, PBMs, and other things. And so what works for one patient, even under Express Scripts, may be something totally different for another patient under Express Scripts, depending on who their employer is and other things. And so you would have to do it patient by patient. The beauty of the real-time benefit check that we're trying to push to the doctors is it sorts through all that. It figures out what plan they're on and what products are right for them under that plan. Because in your workflow, it's very unlikely you're going to have the patients to sit with the patient and go drug by drug.
Well, why not just have set prices for drugs? So Walmart has a website, $4 for 1 month supply. So if I'm going to take propranolol, why doesn't it cost the same for everyone across the board if you're an Express Scripts customer, and that's just a given. It's like priceless, just like at McDonald's.
Yeah, so we love the Walmart $4 generic programs. We actually think, and we actually make a deal with our patients that they get it at the lesser of cost, whatever it is. But remember that the benefit is not decided by the Express Scripts or the Cignas or the CVS. The benefit is decided by your employer. Your employer decides what your copay is going to be at that generic tier, what that copay is going to be at the brand tier or the specialty tier. It's not us. And so SLU may have a more generous benefit than their crosstown rival WashU in an effort to attract better employees. And so the benefit design varies by almost the number of employers that are out there. And so I would love to see more standardization, but what's really even crazy is Medicare. You would think Medicare is a single payer system. Even under Medicare, it's wildly complex for the patients. Remember, there's the initial, even in Part D, you have the initial $450 you're responsible for, and then up to $3,000 you're responsible for another thing. And then you go into the donut hole, and then you come out of the donut hole and go into catastrophic. Every time you fill your prescription, it's a different price, and it drives people nuts. And so the question is, how can we bring simplicity to the marketplace? That's what all patients and doctors would like. Unfortunately, that's not what we see very often.
Yeah. Okay, well, last question, probably a question without an answer, but why are there so many administrators involved in U.S. healthcare, in hospitals and pharmacy benefit managers, everywhere? The number goes up and up and up. The number of physicians stays the same, and obviously all those people involved in healthcare aren't really producing any healthcare. And so why is that? And in 1 minute, what can we do to solve it?
Yeah. So I share your frustration. I will contend there's just too much money sloshing around in healthcare. We are now spending $3.6 trillion on healthcare on an annual basis. If you look at our spend on healthcare, it's bigger than most countries' economies. Our healthcare spend is bigger than the GDP of Canada, okay? And so when there's that much money around, it attracts people. And so healthcare has actually become the single largest employer in the United States, and in most communities, including St. Louis, healthcare is the #1 employer. And so as long as there's this much money and this much profit to be made in healthcare, you're not going to see a difference. And remember, this is at every level. If you compare the U.S. healthcare system to any other healthcare system, doctors make more, nurses make more, hospitals make more, pharmacy makes more, everything makes more. And so, as Dr. Reinhardt, a great economist of Yale, once said, it's all about the money. And so this is all about money. We have made this a big part of our economy, and you should not expect it's going to shrink until people shrink the amount of money they want to put into healthcare.
Why don't we open it up for questions for Dr. Miller? Yes, in the back.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Miller, as well as SLU for hosting this in Cortex. Excellent, excellent discussion. My name is Joe McDonald. I'm one of the co-founders of ePharmix, just upstairs. And my question is, I was reading an interesting article on Modern Healthcare today. A lot of what you talked about as far as just the overall costs, I think the number was 19.4% GDP in the next decade or something like that. And there's an interesting quote in there that talked about, at a certain point, the tipping point of the single-payer system, as that continues to ratchet up, becomes more and more compelling, given the narrative, especially on the Democratic Party with the upcoming presidential election. You shared the single-payer system in Europe and kind of what the different dynamics are there on the pharmacy price side. To those advocates of the single-payer system, what would you say are some of the biggest advantages that the private system, like a Cigna Express Scripts, could bring comparatively to whatever the single-payer system would have?
Yeah, great question, and it actually has lots of layers to it, and also congratulations, you guys have a spectacular company, so big shout out to you. If you take it at its most basic, a single-payer system does have administrative efficiencies, and if you look at most of the single-payer systems, they are cheaper, right? America is much more expensive. The trouble for single-payer systems across the world is actually they're starting to want the same things we want. They want all these new things, and so they're actually trying to catch up with us, which is a real disaster. And so, because remember, healthcare will consume every single dollar you give us, and innovation is driving much of the increased spend. And so how the single-payer systems work in other countries is they actually tend to put a cap on new innovation that's brought to the marketplace. And so if you look at the pharmaceutical availability in Europe versus here, it turns out that while our healthcare system is mediocre for a population, for individuals with serious illness, this is still the best place to get treated. If you have a serious auto accident, if you have cancer, if you need a transplant, our survivals are better than any other country. But the trouble is, for population health, are we vaccinating people? Are we doing prenatal care? Are we doing early childhood care? We're really mediocre. And so for survival statistics, we don't do so well. But we do a lot, we spend a lot more because we're trying to do both. We're trying to claim we want to do population health and personalized care. Most of these other countries just do population health, and they do it really well. And so what do you give up if you get to a single payer system? You will cut down on innovation that comes into the marketplace. That's one of the ways you keep the price down. You will also, to get to a single payer system in the United States, will cause cataclysmic job loss of really high paid people. There is no one that can describe a pathway, because if healthcare has become the #1 employer, what are you going to do with all those people, all those evil administrators that we all hate, people like me? What are you going to do with those unemployed evil administrators? And so the reality is that no one has actually been able to figure out a pathway that gets us there. You give up on innovation, you give up on personalized care, but you do gain a lot in holding down costs. The other things I will contend is healthcare is at the root of a lot of problems in our country we don't talk about. Wage stagnation in this country can be attributed to healthcare. When you look at how much we pay in healthcare for every product you buy, healthcare is making those products non-competitive on the world stage. A car company puts more into healthcare than they do into steel into a car. It is the single biggest component when you make a car. So how can you sell a US car competitively outside of the United States when the other countries aren't burdened with that same level of healthcare? And so I will contend that when you look at why aren't wages recovering as fast as the economy, it's because it's all going into extra healthcare expense. And so it is a real burden. When's the tipping point? I have no ideas. You can go back, and presidents were talking about healthcare expenses 100 years ago. And so this is not a new crisis. Are we getting closer to the tipping point? I'm sure we are, but I have no idea where that's going to be.
Yes.
This is really, really interesting. And I work with orphan diseases, and I do translation and research. So the disease that I research is really rare. So we have about 5,000 to 6,000 patients in the world. And right now we have enzyme replacement therapy for the mucopolysaccharidosis. But this product ended up to be one of the most expensive drugs in the world 2 years ago, where the patient has to pay $500,000 per year. And this treatment is for life. So although I know that there are regulations that will help pharmaceutical companies to be interested in, investing in these sort of rare diseases, do you think there is a good idea or approach to decrease prices in such a way that there is a win-win situation where the patients may have a product that will help them, and at the same time, pharmaceutical companies can have some profit that is sustainable? Because in this way, I don't think 10 or 20 years later, we will still have these expensive diseases covered by insurance companies.
Yeah, great question. So here's the issue of you have these really small populations and you can't price the drug affordably because the only way you're going to attract capital to your pharmaceutical company is you got to price it at literally millions of dollars. Part of it, I told you about this filming with the New York Times. The reason we were doing it is for a rare disease. One family has 3 members. They're each being charged $1.5 million per patient. So the family now has a $4.5 million bill. Our most expensive patient is $6 million a year. So we have, seen this. A couple of things have to happen. One is we need a new model of drug development. And what's ironic is the pharmaceutical companies, when they're talking to investors, they'll say, we've gotten way more efficient. We can now screen 50,000 candidates in just 3 hours using this new machine. Whereas in the old days, it used to take us 5 years to screen 50,000 candidates. And so the idea that they're getting much more efficient, but they can't bring a product out at a lower cost is actually mind-boggling to me. We have one pharmaceutical company, Ultragenyx, has brought 5 products to the marketplace for only $250 million in developmental costs. So when you read out of Tufts that it costs $2.3 million for each drug brought to the marketplace, that's data provided to them by the pharmaceutical companies. It's totally bogus. And so the production cost of different products varies pretty widely. But everyone wants to use what the market will bear. So they all feel compelled to charge these really crazy prices. And so the question is, if you can't get the pharmaceutical companies to do this voluntarily, then are you going to have regulation and legislation to do it? Now, I will tell you that one of the things we really advocate for is great leadership, and I'll give you one great example. There was a head of pharmacology at WashU, Roy Vagelos, who went on to be the CEO at Merck. Merck developed a drug called ivermectin. Ivermectin was for river blindness in Africa. His board of directors says, don't develop this, there's no one that can pay for this. He said, that's wrong, we're going to develop it and we're going to distribute it, and he has saved the vision of millions of people in Africa. Roy Vagelos also went on to do what was called the CPI pledge. He promised he would never raise the price of a Merck product by more than the consumer price index. So if we had done that over the last 10 years, the branded products would have gone up by 15%, not 208%. And so we need great leadership like that, but we also need to revolutionize how we actually both discover drugs, but also approve drugs. Some of the times the NIH trials, the trials often are the highest costing part of bringing a drug to the marketplace, and we got to figure out a different way to do it. And then we're also going to have to figure out, what is, I don't want the government to be in the business of setting how much is a fair profit, but that's where great leadership is going to have to come in. So very difficult, it's a really, really difficult problem to solve.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Every dollar you spend on direct to consumer drug advertising, drug companies get between $7 and $9 return back. And obviously it's a great deal of manipulation on the advertising, and this is not cornflakes, okay? So is there any way to balance the need to know of the patients in terms of information about new drugs and what is clearly a total manipulation that I think is causing distortion on the marketplace?
Yeah, so to Dr. Rothstein's point, number one is pharmaceutical companies spend more on marketing than they do in R&D. So when they're talking about all their spending in R&D, they almost every company spends more on their marketing than their R&D. Worse than that is they bucket many of their marketing dollars in R&D. So when they do consumer research, that actually goes into R&D. We are one of only 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer advertising. The only other country is New Zealand. I don't know why New Zealand, but the United States and New Zealand. And to your point, when a patient sees an ad and goes into a doctor and asks for the sleeping pill with the butterfly, the chance of them getting that is really, really high. So the pharmaceutical companies know that the return on investment in marketing is phenomenally good. Obviously, this has actually been tested in the courts. It's a freedom of speech thing. So when the government has said we want to do away with pharmaceutical advertising, we haven't been able to figure out how to do that. But to be very frank, we should have a prohibition on pharmaceutical advertising, because not only does it work, it's adding to the expense, and they're spending more on that than they are on research. I'll tell you one other pet peeve I have, and then stop, because I could filibuster all night. When the tax cuts occurred a couple of years ago and the manufacturers all got enormous tax cuts, almost none of them put it back into drug development. Almost every single one of them did share buyback. So when they're saying, oh, I got to have these really high costs, why didn't they use that money to actually figure out how to build the infrastructure to actually lower their costs permanently? All they did was buy back shares, and so I find that reprehensible.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. If you'd like a CME, please find your way to the CME sign-in sheet, which I think is back there. If you parked in the lot, we have a parking pass for you. We also encourage everyone to sign up for our Bander Center email list and stay tuned for future events. On Thursday, March 7th at 4 p.m. at the Contemporary Art Museum of St. Louis, Professor Elizabeth Pendo will interview Jerry Menikoff, Director of the Office for Human Resource Protections, and will focus on recent changes to the rules governing human subjects research, especially ownership of biospecimens and informed consent. If you are interested in donating to our center, we'd love to talk to you about that. And if you would like to become more involved in a different way, we'd welcome that too. I'd like to start out with a big thank you to the Cortex Innovation Community who have so graciously hosted us. I'd also like to thank KETC Channel 9 for the audio and the video recording and producing the video version of this event, which you will find on YouTube in the next several weeks. Also to our staff, including Gunnar O'Brien, Denise Webb, and our med student managers, Matt Gracca, Annie Seskleifer, and Jeff Carbonella, and to everyone who showed up and participated in the dialogue today. And of course, thank you, Dr. Miller, for joining us.
Thank you.
And please join us for a drink and a snack. And please join us for a drink and a snack and talk to us, continue the conversation. We have wine and cheese outside for about an hour. Thank you very much.